Last week, we talked about one of the foundational pieces of our Memoir Method group program, reading like a writer. And while I gave you tons of reasons why this practice is important, I didn't do much to tell you how to read like a writer. And that's why we wanted to follow up this two-part series with the hows of reading like a writer. Stay tuned. You've been writing your memoir, maybe even for years. You know your material, you know what it means. What's missing isn't the story, it's the structure. And that's why we started the Memoir Method Book Club. Every single month, Emily Thrash, a professional writer and editor, teaches you how to read like a writer by breaking down a published memoir and showing you what it's doing under the surface. Your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up. Last week, we kicked off this two-part series by thinking about the differences between reading like a reader versus reading like a writer. Of course, as I said last week, when we read like a reader, we are taking in this glossy, edited, professional package and really enjoying how it makes us feel, how it makes us think. On the other side of that coin, though, when we read like writers, we're really reading much more for the mechanics. We're looking at what really makes that book tick. And of course, the reason is not only that we want to make sure we can incorporate the same types of things into our book that we appreciate in others' books, we also just generally want to lift this muscle of decoding the way that choices in the writing stage impact what it's like to read a book in the reading stage. Of course, every decision that we are making in the process of writing a book has to do with the impact we are hoping to have on the reader. And that is why reading like a writer is so important. How else do we know what kinds of impacts our choices will have on readers unless we take the reader's seat ourselves and put that little extra sleuth hat on to figure out why it is that particular decisions within the text of a book impact us as readers way after the thing has been developed, drafted, revised, polished, and published. So, with that said, let's dig into 3 components of how we can really be thinking about reading like a writer, even if you are just getting started, picking up memoirs, decoding them, and figuring out how you want to put them into your book. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a couple of themes for this entire video because you will hear me say these things multiple times, but I also find it's really helpful just to kind of have this framework in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the how of reading like a writer. So, the framework that I'm talking about is that we have got 2 components that we are always looking for when we are reading like writers. The first of these is keeping in mind that all books are simply a series of seemingly infinite choices. That as any writer is going through the process of drafting a manuscript that will eventually become a book, we are just making choice after choice after choice, both at the high up 10,000 foot view level where we are making usually structural choices, and at the on the ground, in the weeds detail level, where those choices often feel much more obvious to us than at the structural level. So throughout all of these tips, the first thing to keep in mind is it is so important to remember that even though it can feel like writing is something that kind of just comes to us, it's a bolt of lightning of inspiration, actually, really all it is a series of decisions that every writer has to make as they go through the process of drafting. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that all of these choices have essentially infinite answers, and none of those answers is right or wrong. Unfortunately, we see this so often at Page and Podium that new writers will come to us and they're so hopeful that having a coach will mean someone will just tell them the right answer. Unfortunately, that would actually not be doing you a service at all, because in truth, when we think about this writing process, there really are no rights and wrongs. Every decision that we are making is just simply based on how we want to impact our reader. Who is our reader? What do they like? What do they not like? What will they relate to? What will they find totally unbelievable? All of these are choices that you are making within that process of writing. And conversely, they are also all choices that we can see in published work if we know what we're looking for. Which is a great segue into the 3 levels at which I want you to start reading like a writer. Because we will be moving from that 10,000-foot view area all the way down to in the weeds, in the details, and I think you'll see how the choices from that top level impact the bottom level choices. Typically, we are going to be thinking about moving from the big picture to the details, large to small, general to specific. Okay, so the first level at which you are going to read like a writer is probably the level that will have the biggest impact, but it's also the level that is the most difficult to do on your own. And that is reading like a writer for structure. If you are a fan of this podcast, even if you've been watching at all, you have no doubt heard me talk about structure and outlining. It is basically my mission to make sure that every first-time memoir writer not only understands the value of structuring out your book in advance, of creating that outline, but also that you have a sense of how to do that in a way that does not rely on a magical bolt of lightning inspiration, but rather that relies on a series of steps that really you can take on, perfect, and really dial in to serve yourself in your book. And this is why structure matters so much, and it's why it's the main thing we want you to think about as you are reading like a writer. Now, when we're thinking about structure, it's really important to keep in mind the why. I do sometimes find that folks will kind of imagine that structure is sort of a buzzword or maybe even kind of a key to the gatekeepers, that if you have the right structure, you're going to be able to get through that publishing gate, but that really structure doesn't serve that much else otherwise. Not true. Not only is structure so important to even finishing the book as a writer, structure is also so key to keeping your reader on board. And the reason is trust. So this is a little bit difficult to kind of imagine and understand because you are not likely to find a professionally published book that doesn't have structure. Unfortunately, even often books that are meant to seem a little bit more experimental will typically have the bones of some kind of typical standard structure underneath, even though structure is really something that's kind of like the studs in your wall, right? We don't want to see them, but they're pretty integral. Now, what is difficult about this is because we can't see examples of what it's like to read a book without structure, we often aren't really sure what it should look like in our own book. So what I want you to kind of imagine to really get a sense of what this is going to feel like to be structured versus unstructured is I really want you to think about if you have ever listened to someone telling you a story, oftentimes like the first time they've told the story, maybe first or second, but where they kind of haven't landed on what the point is. They kind of haven't landed on where exactly they want to go, what things are important, what things are not important. So you kind of are listening to them tell this story and you're not really sure where they're going with it. This is very often how it feels to read a book without structure. I can tell you, as someone who does read books without structure as part of my job, it is not subtle. But, of course, the fact that you need structure doesn't really tell you how to get structure. So here is where this tip on reading like a writer comes in. What I want you to do as you are reading like a writer for structure is I want you to start by doing an exercise we talk about a lot in the revision stage of your book, but that can be really helpful here as well. And that is the reverse outline. Now, when we're talking about a reverse outline, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. Think of a regular outline. Of course, you are making kind of a list of what's going to go into your book. Usually it's kind of hierarchically organized so that we have kind of nested different subjects, Roman numerals, capital letters, etc., so on and so forth. When we think about reverse outlining, rather than listing out all the things that go in the book before we write it, now we are taking a written book, in this case, someone else's book that someone else wrote, and you are going to go through literally paragraph by paragraph by paragraph and analyze out what is happening. in the end, we end up with something that is very, very similar to a traditional outline, except now you have the written book and you know exactly what is in there. Of course, when we are trying to decode structure, the easiest way is to see the plans. If you want to see how the studs and the frame of your house are laid out, guaranteed the easiest way is to get your hands on a copy of the blueprints. And effectively, when we do this reverse outlining, we are just making our own blueprint for someone else's house/book. So as you are going through these books, really trying to think about how these choices are impacting the reader, how these choices kind of came to be in the process of writing, if you have this reverse outline to consult, now you are so much better prepared to come in at that 10,000-foot view and really see what's going on. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of what this might look like in practice for you. So I want to give you both an example of something you might see and not like, and an example of something that you might see and like. So let's start with the not liking example. Let's say that as you're reading the book on your first read, you're like, oh my gosh, this middle part really, really drags. Like, what is happening here? Because, of course, you don't want your book to drag like that. Well, once you get to the stage with this book of making this reverse outline from this book that you've read, you are likely going to see that there is a structural issue at the point where you felt the book dragged. Without the reverse outline, it's difficult to see this, but oftentimes when we feel that drag in pacing, when we go back through and analyze out the structure, we can pretty easily see, oh, it's like 40, 50, 60 pages where really nothing is moving forward in terms of the overall plot and message. Well, that is something we really need to know, right? Because that is going to clue you in on what you do not like. And if you don't like it in other people's book, you're not going to like it in your book either. So we might as well get our finger on the pulse of our likes and dislikes to make sure that at least if someone's happy with our book, it's us. Okay, so that's my example of something you might not like. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, and by the way, this is very common, you may see, you know what, this book grabbed me from the first page. I was in it. Well, you know what, that is very, very often, at least in part, due to the structure. Structure, of course, is the whole entire thing we're doing during our development stage. And our development stage not only includes the major turning points within the scope of the book itself, structure also includes where you choose to begin and where you choose to end. So when we are armed with that reverse outline, we not only have this kind of decontextualized sense of what happened on the first page, we can see how that first page fits in with what's coming. And that is often so illuminating, especially, by the way, in memoir. Now, I want to come back to those two thematic points that I already kind of spoiled early in the video, because I think they're really, really helpful at all three levels. The first one you remember, writing is about choices. When we are reading like a writer, we are looking to decode that author's choices. And that is as true for structure as it is any other part of the book. We are looking for how they chose to begin and end, how they set up their climax and their denouement, how they spaced their plot points to keep that reader engaged. We get a bird's eye view of the choices that they made. And those are all choices that you will have to make too. So having that bird's eye view is so helpful in thinking about what are the choices that you have as options. But of course, here is the second point of that two-part theme, and that is that none of those choices are right or wrong. Yes, friends, even in the example that I gave of the book that drug for 50 pages or so, while that's your opinion that drug for 50 pages or so, other readers may not feel that way at all. And in fact, if you have ever picked up an experimental or a literary work, something called a literary work, either fiction, memoir, whatever, you will likely have picked something up that you personally didn't like, but that was really critically raved on. And that is just simply because there's no right or wrong. The thing we are aiming for is impact on our reader. And readers are as different as anything else that there are billions of. When we think about those choices, we need to be thinking about how we are connecting with our audience first. Because when we try to go for that right or wrong, we often just end up with something that's frankly pretty generic. Okay, so that is my structure note. The second thing, we're gonna move from this 10,000 foot view where we are thinking of structure and development. We're gonna move down to a show or tell. Now, if you've been watching this channel long, you know I have a really troubled relationship with the show versus tell advice. I often find that people will come to me and say something like, oh, well, I know I'm supposed to show, not tell. The problem, and this is not only in memoir, but it is especially true in memoir, is that we don't always show. Of course we don't. Sometimes we must tell. In memoir, in particular, yes, there are lots of things we want to show. It's good writing, it's engaging, but a lot of memoir is telling. A lot of memoir is interpretation and reflection and philosophy. And especially when you're talking hybrid memoir, you've probably also got some expertise and training and maybe some facts and research too. All of that stuff is very, very likely to fall into the tell category. So now that we know we are not always showing versus telling, well, we've got some more difficult choices to make, right? Because as we go into this show versus tell, now we find that for every single point you want to make, we've got to decide whether it's a scene or exposition. So when you are reading with a writer, how do you do this? Well, let me first give you a little tool in terms of how we think about scene versus exposition, or in other words, show versus tell. So what I like to say in the Memoir Method is when we're thinking about a scene is always going to be something that the camera could capture. Now, the camera can capture lots of things, right? The camera can very well capture you having a conversation with your best friend over coffee. And you may regale your best friend with the most exciting thing that happened to you last week. But if we show a scene, if the camera captures you and your friend having that conversation over coffee, well, that is a type of scene, right? But that most exciting thing that happened, well, we have now told that, right? That has now come through conversation. Whereas we also could make the choice, instead of showing this scene of you and your friend at coffee, we can actually just show the scene of what happened. We can have the camera capture the actual scene itself. What the camera captures, that is a scene. But when we talk about just giving that information, that's exposition. That we might think about rather than something the camera captures. We might think about exposition more as a type of context. When you think about telling some really exciting story to your friend, very, very often you have to give a little context, right? You have to get a little bit of background so that they can understand where you're coming from. Well, this is just simply exposition in real life. You are giving them the things that are not really worth showing. It's not worth doing a whole scene for every single bit of background, but we still have to share it. So in that case, it might make sense to you to choose to give some of the context from that coffee chat with your best friend in the same way that you gave that coffee chat with your best friend, right? Maybe you started out by kind of giving some background. Maybe you even want to tell that background through this scene of you and your friend. But then we might want to shift. We might want to do a flashback and go back into the actual scene and let the camera capture that actual scene. That would be a show choice, right? On the other end, we might decide that actually it works really well for whatever reason, hopefully reader impact, to keep all of this in tell version in this kind of coffee shop scene. So we have a lot of different levels here, but the point that I want to make is it is always your choice. You always get to choose whether you want to just simply tell us or whether you want to set a whole scene and lay everything out as though the reader is there experiencing it themselves. It's always your choice. And as a reminder, remember first, there are infinite choices. You are always going to be making choices. And in fact, one thing I really want to emphasize in this particular point, this show versus tell, very often the first choice you make won't even be the final choice. Very, very commonly, folks will read through their first draft and catch either a lot of places where they were telling and wish they were showing, or a lot of places where they were showing and wish they were telling, or more likely, some of both. So, as you are thinking through these choices, remember that point 2, there's no right or wrong. You are always going to be making your best guess based, again, on how you hope the thing will impact the reader. So, to circle this back around then to reading like a writer, what we really want you to do is, as you are going through these books that you're reading like a writer, we want you to really pay attention. Where did that author give you a scene? Where did that author drop you into the middle of the action? Where did that author show you through the lens of a camera? And where did they simply tell you? Where did they simply get a couple sentences out and leave it? When we're looking at this, then we can get, again, a good sense of how we feel. If you don't like it in somebody else's book, you probably won't like it in yours. So again, you can go back to this reverse outline, you can look in the text of the book, really think about what do you like and what do you dislike. And all that time, we're just flexing that muscle of thinking about all of these mechanical writer choices so that we're that much more prepared to integrate them into our own writing. Okay, and the third level, this is the simplest, but also the least bounded. That is the details. So here, we're just simply talking about everything else. Everything that's not development or structure, everything that's not kind of those main big choices, scene versus exposition, everything else goes here. And because this is such a huge grab bag category, it's really pretty difficult to give you any kind of definitive advice on where you're going to go here. One area that I do find is so helpful for our clients is focusing on reading that dialogue. Now, for whatever reason, dialogue can be something that really gives people a mental block. It really can just trip you up to be writing dialogue for the first time. Most people feel pretty inept, and they're often just as unsure about the mechanics as they are about actually what words to use. Here is where reading like a writer is magical, frankly. As we are reading through how different authors approach dialogue, one thing that you will see is that really there's guidelines, not rules. When you look at how these different authors will approach dialogue, you will see subtle differences between almost every author. We all have our own stylistic preferences. We all have our own presentational preferences. All through this process of reading like a writer, the thing that I want you to do is really focus on the choices that that author is making. Where do you see choices that you really resonate, and where do you see choices that do not resonate with you at all? And most of all, can you guess why that author made that choice? This is the key in this details level. When we're thinking about structure, when we're thinking about show tell, and when we're thinking about details, we are always thinking about the choices that the writer made, and we're always thinking about why they made them. But when it comes to these detail choices, things like dialogue, yes, but also all of those little minuscule choices that you'll see throughout the book, the thing that I really want you to lean into is thinking about why that author made that choice. And we can typically presume that most really professionally published books, hopefully the author was thinking of their reader. So how can you, as a reader who is also a writer, translate or not the choices that that author made into your own choices, into your own attempt to connect with an audience, share a story, share a message, and move them on their way a little bit easier than they had it before? Okay. So I hope that thinking through these 3 levels of reading like a writer has been helpful. If you missed last week's episode on why this is so important, hop back there now, go through that. But as we are moving through out of this first month of 2026 somehow, I really want you to be thinking about how you will be making progress on this book. Reading like a writer is crucially important. And Page and Podium has just opened a new offering called our Memoir Method Book Club. During the Memoir Method Book Club, you are getting tips exactly like this except the tips that you will get will be related to the specific memoir we are reading each week. So not only will you get to hear us talk about these choices at this kind of abstract level that I did today, you also get to hear us talk about those choices at the level of an actual text. Y'all, I cannot tell you how key this is going to be, how much this is going to move the needle, not only for this specific project, but for your writing in general. I would love to see you in the book club. If you're interested, head over to pageandpodium.com/book club. Sign up. We will let you know when the next meeting is, what the book is going to be, all that good jazz, and we hope that you will be able to join us. In the meantime, keep writing, keep reading like a writer, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Happy writing. You know that feeling when a book just hits you? Not because the story is wild, but because it's shaped so intentionally that it almost makes you rethink your own story. You finish that last page and think, how did they do that? The structure, the honesty, the clarity. There's something under the surface that you just can't put your finger on. And the reason is, unless someone shows you how memoirs actually work, it's hard to translate that inspiration into your own writing. And that's exactly why we created the Memoir Method Monthly Book Club. If you want to join Emily Thrash every single month to dig into an exemplary memoir and figure out what's happening under the surface, head over to pageandpodium.com/book club. Your first month is free, and we can't wait to welcome you to the group.